An Airbus A321 of the Pakistani airline Airblue is preparing to connect Karachi with Islamabad on a routine flight. The crew, led by an experienced captain, takes off without incident with 152 souls on board. Islamabad has awakened shrouded in dense fog. The Margalla Hills, normally visible from miles away, have vanished in the rain. In the cockpit to face this challenging approach, two pilots with very different levels of experience share control. The captain, one of the most senior in the company. The first officer, much younger, a former military pilot now adapting to the civilian world. What is about to happen will turn this flight into one of the most analyzed in the history of Pakistani aviation. A series of factors will begin to align as the aircraft approaches Islamabad, and the line between routine and irreversible will start to blur. July 28, 2010. Jinnah International Airport, Karachi, Pakistan. It is just past 7 a.m. in Pakistan, and here, Airblue Flight 202 is awaiting clearance to taxi to its assigned departure runway. Flight 202 connects Jinnah International Airport in Karachi, one of the country's most populous cities and its economic hub, with Benazir Bhutto International Airport in Islamabad, the nation's capital. This route is key for domestic air travel, lasting approximately 2 hours. The flight plan calls for a direct northeast route covering more than 1,000 kilometers, ultimately approaching Islamabad from the southwest. But this airport has its quirks. Runway 12, chosen due to prevailing winds, does not have an ILS, requiring a visual maneuver known as a circling approach, after first aligning with the opposite runway, 30, using the instrument landing system. The aircraft is an Airbus A321-231, registration APBJB. Built in April 2000, it had logged more than 34,000 flight hours over 13,500 cycles. It was originally delivered to Aero Lloyd in Europe before being acquired by Airblue in 2006. The A321 is a stretched version of the A320, with capacity for more than 180 passengers, 2 IAEV 2533 engines, and advanced avionics managed by the fly-by-wire flight control system. Airblue was founded in 2003 by Shahid Khaqan Abbasi, with the aim of competing against the state-owned Pakistan International Airlines. Its fleet, composed entirely of Airbus aircraft, offered domestic flights and connections to the Persian Gulf. In just 7 years, the airline had established itself as a modern and efficient alternative, known for competitive fares and a strong focus on customer service. At the controls of the A321 is Captain Pervez Iqbal Chaudhry, 61 years old, one of Airblue's most experienced commanders, with 25,497 flight hours, 1,060 on A320 and A321 aircraft. Alongside him is First Officer Muntajib Ahmed Chugtai, 34 years old, a former F-16 fighter pilot in the Pakistan Air Force, with 1,837 flight hours, 286 of them on the A320. Also on board were 4 flight attendants. The cabin crew was qualified and in compliance with regulations, although their working dynamic, as we will see, would play a crucial role in this flight. The flight was carrying 146 passengers, including 110 men, 29 women, 5 children, and 2 infants. Most were Pakistani, but there were 4 foreign nationals on board: a Somali diplomat, an Austrian citizen, and 2 Americans. Also traveling were 6 members of the Pakistan Youth Parliament and 3 off-duty flight crew members. At 7:41 a.m., Airblue Flight 202 began its takeoff roll. The aircraft climbed smoothly and set course for Islamabad. The sky, gray but stable in this part of the country, gave no hint of what awaited in Islamabad. On board, passengers and crew settled in for what was supposed to be a routine domestic flight of less than 2 hours. In the cockpit, however, the atmosphere was tense from the very start. Captain Pervez Iqbal Chaudhry, one of Airblue's most senior pilots, began the flight with an unorthodox attitude. There was no cordial exchange, no friendly cross-checking. From the initial climb, he subjected the first officer to a sort of technical interrogation disguised as instruction. The questions were constant, cutting, and the answers from the co-pilot grew increasingly hesitant. For an entire hour, the captain seemed more focused on asserting his authority than on cooperating with his second-in-command. "Don't you know anything about this either?" he even remarked in a disparaging tone. The captain's words slowly eroded the first officer's confidence, leading him to retreat into uncomfortable silence. There was no camaraderie, no mutual trust, only hierarchy and tension. At 8:58, the aircraft began its descent toward Islamabad. The weather, far from what they had left behind in Karachi, was adverse. Reduced visibility, intermittent rain, and a thick cloud layer barely revealing the ground. From the control center came word that conditions were at the minimum for a visual approach to runway 12. This runway lacked an ILS, so the standard procedure required an approach to the opposite runway 30, followed by a visual circling maneuver to runway 12. To do this, pilots must maintain visual contact with the airport at all times and remain within a protected area of 8 kilometers. But Chaudhry, confident in his abilities and dismissive of the idea of waiting, refused to follow the visual procedure. Instead of using HDG mode to fly each leg of the maneuver, he decided to use the autopilot's nav mode, something not intended for this type of approach. He programmed a series of fictitious waypoints into the flight management system, including an imaginary point 11, toward which the aircraft would head before turning to align with runway 12. The first officer, though clearly puzzled by this decision, did not dare to object. But he eventually asked, "But are we visual?" The captain's reply was evasive, and he simply pressed on. "40 minutes later, at 9:37 a.m., already at the minimum altitude of 2,500 feet, they still had no visual contact with the runway. Even so, the captain ordered a descent to 2,300 feet, violating the minimum safe altitude. The controller suggested they enter a holding pattern. The captain's response to his co-pilot was sarcastic. "Let him say whatever he wants, we'll keep going." At this point, the first officer began to grow uneasy. "Sir, the terrain must be very close," he warned. And he was right. Seconds later, the EGPWS began sounding.
"Terrain ahead. Pull up."
Despite the warning, the captain insisted on continuing toward the fictitious point 11, hoping the automation would magically align them with the runway centerline. The controller asked if they had the runway in sight. The first officer hesitated. "What should I tell him, sir?" The captain replied, "Tell him yes." Both lied to ATC. Airblue 202 is visual with the terrain, but they were not. At 9:39 a.m., the aircraft continued descending below the minimum altitude, outside the protected area, heading straight toward the Margalla Hills. The captain tried to turn the aircraft manually using the heading knob. However, he forgot an essential step. With the autopilot in nav mode, a heading change would have no effect unless the knob was pulled to engage HDG mode. He turned the knob, but did not pull it. The heading was recorded as an intention, but the aircraft kept following its programmed route. Meanwhile, the system warnings intensified.
"Terrain ahead. Pull up."
The co-pilot grew desperate.
Pull
"Turn, sir! Turn! Climb, sir!" The captain, finally confused, pulled the knob, but in his desperation, he had already turned it so far that the selected heading was 086 degrees, almost due east, causing the aircraft, instead of turning left, to bank right, directly toward the heart of the mountains. At that moment, the captain disconnected the autopilot and took manual control. The aircraft briefly climbed to 3,100 feet, but their time had already run out minutes before. The captain made a sharp left roll, 52 degrees of bank, while simultaneously pushing the control stick forward, lowering the nose. The co-pilot shouted, "Terrain, sir!" At 9:41 a.m., in the middle of the fog, with rain striking the airframe, the Airbus A321 slammed into the Margalla Hills. A fireball lit up the slope, and the wreckage scattered through the forest. There were no survivors. All 152 people on board died instantly. The most tragic part was not the weather, nor a technical failure. It was the systematic dismissal of every warning, every procedure, every dissenting voice. It was the story of a pilot who chose to fly alone, even with someone by his side willing to help. The impact occurred at 9:41 a.m., but for several minutes, no one in Islamabad fully understood what had just happened. Some residents near the Margalla Hills reported hearing a muffled explosion, followed by a metallic echo, and shortly after, a column of smoke rising through the fog. On the ground, a witness later described that the plane was flying as low as a 4-story building before disappearing behind the vegetation. The first reports spoke of a missing aircraft. Soon, Army helicopters began circling over the northern area of the capital. Weather conditions, however, made access extremely difficult: persistent rain, mountainous terrain, and near-zero visibility. At 10:30, a helicopter finally located the crash site near the Dominico viewpoint. Landing was impossible due to the rugged landscape. From the ground, the armed forces, local police, and civilian volunteers began advancing on foot through mud, rocks, and wet vegetation. The scene they found was harrowing. Pieces of fuselage scattered among the trees, still smoldering wreckage, parts of the aircraft embedded in trunks. The bodies were burned and mutilated, many beyond recognition. A state of emergency was declared in all Islamabad hospitals. The operation was described by the media as chaotic. A lack of coordination between institutions, armed forces, police, and rescue workers complicated the effort. Most of the teams that reached the site belonged to the counterterrorism police, with no specific training for rescue operations. Several volunteers stated that, for hours, digging through the wreckage with their bare hands was the only option available. Even so, the teams managed to recover the bodies of all 152 people on board. There were no survivors. For days, the rain gave no respite, silently accompanying the recovery of remains and the start of one of the saddest investigations in Pakistan's aviation history. What had happened? How could they have ended up crashing into the mountains? The investigation into the crash of Airblue Flight 202 was led by the Pakistan Civil Aviation Authority, CAA, as the authority responsible for the state of occurrence and the state of registry. A multidisciplinary team was formed under ICAO Annex 13 regulations, with the participation of accredited representatives from Airbus France, the NTSB, United States, and IAE, the engine manufacturer based in Germany. The technical analysis of the flight was based mainly on the recovery of the black boxes, which were found on July 31, 2010. Both were damaged by the post-impact fire, but thanks to the intervention of the French BEA, all flight data was successfully extracted. The FDR provided 27 hours of recordings, and the CVR clearly captured the last 2 hours of audio, including pilot voices, ATC communications, and cockpit alarms. The aircraft and its systems were in optimal condition. The Airbus A321, registration APBJB, showed no technical faults prior to the flight. The aircraft had passed its daily inspections, and no anomalies were found in its navigation systems, engines, or sensors. All evidence pointed to a fully airworthy and functional aircraft at the time of the accident. Weather conditions were marginal, but within operational limits. Visibility was reduced, with low clouds and rain preventing a standard visual landing on runway 12. However, several flights had managed to land in Islamabad shortly before, while others chose to divert. The conditions alone did not justify a loss of control or controlled flight into terrain. The captain ignored multiple established procedures. The visual, circling approach pattern to runway 12 requires staying within an 8-kilometer safety zone from the airport and maintaining a minimum altitude of 2,500 feet. However, the captain programmed a custom route into the FMS outside that zone, thereby violating the approach chart and exiting the protected area. This decision was entirely incompatible with regulations and operational logic. Improper use of NAV mode instead of HDG mode. A visual approach requires manual maneuvering assisted by the autopilot in selected heading mode, HDG, which allows adaptation to visual conditions. However, the captain used NAV mode, normally reserved for pre-programmed cruise routes, which limited the aircraft's responsiveness to obstacles. The aircraft was attempting to follow non-standard manually inserted waypoints, taking it away from the charted protection area. The captain violated the authorized minimum altitude. The descent to 2,300 feet, 200 feet below the 2,500-foot minimum, was carried out without meteorological or visual justification, despite being in an area with high terrain to the north. This critical decision placed the aircraft in a deadly corridor, leaving no margin for recovery in the event of any deviation. The response to EGPWS warnings was late and inadequate. The EGPWS began issuing verbal alerts, terrain ahead, pull up, approximately 60 seconds before impact. Despite this, the captain did not follow Airbus's published escape procedure, which calls for disconnecting the autopilot, applying maximum thrust, and climbing at the maximum pitch-up attitude. The response was inconsistent. A heading change was attempted, but without properly disengaging nav mode. A climb was initiated, but without maintaining maximum power. This delayed the decisive turn and reduced the altitude gained in the final seconds. Late autopilot disconnection and loss of situational awareness. For more than 30 seconds, the captain failed to realize the aircraft was still in nav mode. When he finally disconnected the autopilot, it was too late. The programmed left turn had been set incorrectly, and the aircraft was beginning to bank right. The captain even exclaimed, "Why isn't the plane turning?" Evidence of a complete disconnect between his intentions and what the system was actually doing. Serious cockpit resource management (CRM) failures. The working environment was toxic. The captain humiliated and discredited the first officer from takeoff onward. This behavior eliminated any chance of effective cooperation during critical moments. The co-pilot's warnings were ignored or downplayed. Even when the first officer suggested a go-around, his voice carried no weight. This represented a serious violation of CRM principles, where hierarchy must never inhibit operational safety. The official CAA report classified the accident as a case of controlled flight into terrain caused by human factors, specifically deliberate violations of standard operating procedures, improper use of the flight management system and autopilot, failure to adequately respond to multiple terrain warnings, first officer's inability to assert corrective authority due to the cockpit environment, poor hierarchical culture within the crew. The investigation concluded on March 7, 2011, and included several recommendations to prevent a recurrence. Improve pilot training in CRM and situational awareness. Explicitly prohibit the use of nav mode for unscheduled visual approaches. Establish psychological and behavioral evaluations in periodic pilot assessments. Develop internal safety programs that foster collaborative environments between pilots. Update approach charts and FMS software to include warnings for non-protected areas. The crash of Flight 202 revealed not only a piloting error, but also deeper flaws in operational culture, training, and command dynamics. It was a wake-up call showing how even a technically qualified crew can fail when communication, mutual respect, and adherence to the most basic procedures are eroded. The accident was the deadliest in Pakistan's history, with 152 victims. Airblue and the government offered compensation to the families. The airline's image was seriously damaged, although it continued operations. This event, together with subsequent accidents in the country, triggered a nationwide review of pilot licensing and training in Pakistan, revealing structural problems in the industry. Following the crash, improvements were pushed in the training of Pakistani flight crews, and international scrutiny increased on the local aviation authority. Updates to approach procedures in Islamabad were promoted, and CRM training was reinforced to prevent cockpits from being dominated by toxic hierarchies. Today, this case is studied as an example of the risks posed by poor organizational culture and the captain's overconfidence. Airblue built a monument bearing the names of the victims, located in Islamabad, to honor those who perished. Every year, families and authorities pay tribute to the 152 people who lost their lives in the Margalla Hills. The memorial stands not only as a reminder of the tragedy, but also as a call for the constant improvement of aviation safety. Thank you for traveling with me to July 28, 2010, when Airblue Flight 202 became an avoidable tragedy. One more in aviation history, this time the result of a chain of poor decisions in an adverse environment. This journey leaves a clear lesson. No captain, no matter how experienced, should ever ignore procedures or the voice of their first officer. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to leave a comment and subscribe to keep discovering the story behind each flight.